Find somewhere comfortable. It might be your bed or a chair that knows the shape of you by now. You don't need to sit in any particular way. You don't need to hold anything in your mind or try to remember what comes next. Just let the words arrive, the way rain arrives on a window. Quietly, without asking anything of you. If today was hard, you can put it down now, not forever, just for a little while. The day has already done what it was going to do. Whatever you are carrying tonight, the worry, the tiredness, the low hum of something you can't quite name, none of it needs to be solved right now. You are allowed to simply be here, in this quiet, in this moment, with nothing required of you. We are going to spend some time together tonight exploring something rather beautiful, the science of stillness. What happens inside you, inside the soft, ancient tissue of your brain, inside the chemistry of your blood and your cells, when you become quiet, when you stop, when you let the world recede and simply rest in the awareness of being alive. It is a gentle subject, and we will move through it gently, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your eyes close if they want to. The words will find you wherever you are. We are in no hurry tonight. There is a word in the Pali language, one of the oldest languages in which human beings try to describe the inner life, and that word is sati. It is usually translated as mindfulness, but that translation is a little thin, a little too tidy for what the word actually contains. Sati carries within it the ideas of attention, of awareness, of presence. It suggests a quality of knowing. Not the sharp, urgent knowing of someone trying to solve a problem, but the softer, more patient knowing of someone who is simply here, noticing what is. The people who first used that word lived roughly 2,500 years ago in the forests and river valleys of ancient India. They sat beneath trees and by the banks of slow rivers. They watched the movement of their own breath. They noticed thoughts arising and passing away, like clouds crossing a wide, still sky. They were not trying to achieve anything in particular. They were simply learning to be present with what was already here. And they noticed something. Something that took Western science another 2 millennia to begin to measure and confirm. They noticed that this practice, this gentle, patient, unhurried practice of paying attention, changed something, not just in the moment of sitting quietly, but in the texture of daily life. The way emotions moved through them, the way pain was held, the way fear lost some of its sharp edge, the way sleep came more easily at night. They did not have brain scanners. They did not have electroencephalograms or cortisol assays or functional magnetic resonance imaging. They had only their own experience, carefully observed, carefully described, and passed on across generations in the form of teachings and practices. What is remarkable, and what we are only now beginning to fully appreciate, is how right they were. Because when modern neuroscientists finally turned their instruments toward the meditating brain, what they found was not vague or anecdotal. It was structural. It was chemical. It was measurable. The ancient practitioners had been doing something real, something that left visible traces in the physical matter of the brain itself. And that is where our story begins tonight. Not with urgency, not with anything you need to do or remember. Just a quiet exploration of what happens inside you when you become still. Long before anyone thought to put a person inside a brain scanner, human beings were already deeply curious about the nature of their own minds. The earliest written references to contemplative practice appear in the Hindu Upanishads, texts composed around 1500 years before the Common Era. These were not scientific documents in any modern sense. They were more like philosophical poetry, attempts to describe, in words, something that words kept failing to fully capture, the experience of a mind that had become, for a moment, completely quiet. Around 600 years before the Common Era, Buddhist traditions began to develop these practices with greater precision and structure. Two particular modes of practice emerged that are worth sitting with for a moment. The first was called samatha, sometimes translated as calm abiding or vigilant attention. This was the practice of steadying the mind on a single object, usually the breath, and gently returning to it whenever the mind wandered away. Patient, unhurried. Again and again. The second practice was called vipassana, meaning insight. This was a subtler practice, not just steadying the attention, but using that steady attention to observe the nature of experience itself, to watch how thoughts arise, how they change, how they pass. To see, with a kind of quiet clarity, that nothing in the inner world is fixed or permanent. These two practices, working together, formed the foundation of what we now call mindfulness. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, something shifted. A doctor named Herbert Benson, working at Harvard Medical School in the early 1970s, began to take a scientific interest in meditation. He was a cardiologist, primarily concerned with blood pressure and heart disease, and he had noticed something curious about some of his patients who practiced meditation. Their physiological markers, blood pressure, heart rate, the rate at which they consumed oxygen, were measurably different from those of people who did not meditate, different in a way that suggested a specific, reproducible biological response. He called it the relaxation response. It was, he argued, the physiological opposite of the fight or flight response. This was a significant moment. Not because the idea was entirely new, the meditators had known something like this for millennia, but because it translated an ancient practice into the language of Western medicine. It made it measurable. It made it discussable in hospitals and universities and medical journals. And then, in 1979, a microbiologist named Jon Kabat-Zinn did something even more consequential. Kabat. Zinn had been a student of Zen Buddhist meditation for years. He was also a scientist, trained at MIT, and he was deeply interested in the question of whether the benefits of meditation could be made available to people who would never set foot in a monastery, people who were ill, or in chronic pain, or simply overwhelmed by the weight of their lives. He founded the Stress Reduction Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and there he developed an 8-week program he called Mindfulness, Based Stress Reduction, MBSR. It was a secular program, drawing on the ancient practices but stripped of any particular religious framing. It taught people to pay attention to their breath, to their bodies, to their thoughts, in a non-judgmental way. To notice what was arising in their experience without immediately trying to fix it or push it away. The results were striking. Patients with chronic pain reported that their relationship to the pain had changed. Not that the pain was gone, but that it was no longer quite so overwhelming, no longer quite so all-consuming. People with anxiety found that the constant background noise of their worried minds had quieted somewhat. People with stress-related illnesses showed improvements in their physical health. Kabat-Zinn wrote about all of this in a book called Full Catastrophe Living, published in 1991. The title came from a line in the film Zorba the Greek, in which the main character describes his life, wife, children, house, everything, as the full catastrophe. Kabat. Zen used it to suggest that mindfulness was not about escaping the fullness and difficulty of life, but about learning to be present with it, to meet it without flinching. That book, and the program it described, opened a door. And through that door, over the following decades, came an extraordinary flowering of scientific research. Thousands of studies, dozens of research centers, a whole new field of inquiry dedicated to understanding what happens in the brain and body when a person becomes mindful. We are still in the early chapters of that story. But what has already been discovered is, quietly, rather wonderful. Imagine, for a moment, that you could hold a human brain in your hands. Not a diagram of one, but the actual thing. Soft, folded, slightly grey, weighing roughly the same as a small cantaloupe. About 1.4 kilograms of the most complex organized matter that we know of in the universe. Inside that soft mass, there are roughly 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others. A network so vast and intricate that if you were to lay all of its connections end to end, they would stretch for several 100,000 miles. This is the organ that is changed by mindfulness. Physically, measurably, verifiably changed. The mechanism behind this is something called neural plasticity. The brain's capacity to reorganize itself, to grow new connections and strengthen existing ones in response to experience. For a long time, scientists believed that the brain was essentially fixed by early adulthood, that the structure you had at 25 was more or less the structure you would have for the rest of your life. We now know that this is not true. The brain remains capable of significant structural change throughout life. And one of the things that can change it is sustained, regular meditation. A neuroscientist named Sarah Lazar, working at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, was one of the first people to demonstrate this with rigorous imaging data. In the mid-2000s, her lab began scanning the brains of long-term meditators, people who had been practicing for years, sometimes decades, and comparing them to the brains of non-meditators. What she found was remarkable. The meditators had more cortical thickness in specific regions of the brain. The cortex is the outer layer of the brain, the deeply folded grey tissue that is associated with higher cognitive functions. Attention, awareness, decision-making, emotional regulation. In the meditators, certain regions of this cortex were measurably thicker than in non-meditators of the same age. One of the most striking findings involved aging. As we get older, the cortex naturally thins. It is one of the reasons that attention and certain cognitive abilities can become more effortful with age. But in Lazar's meditators, this thinning was slower. In some regions, 50-year-old meditators had cortical thickness comparable to 25-year-olds who did not meditators. The practice appeared to be, in some sense, protecting the brain against the ordinary wear of time. Then came an even more accessible finding. Lazar's lab, and others, began studying what happened, not in people who had been meditating for decades, but in people who were entirely new to the practice. People who enrolled in an 8-week MBSR program and had their brains scanned before and after. 8 weeks. That is all. 40 minutes of practice a day for 8 weeks. And the brains of these people showed detectable, measurable structural changes. 4 regions in particular showed increased volume, increased density of grey matter after those 8 weeks. The first was the left hippocampus, a curved structure deep in the brain that plays a central role in learning, memory, and emotional regulation. The hippocampus is also one of the regions most vulnerable to the effects of chronic stress. Stress hormones can actually shrink it over time. Mindfulness appeared to be working in the opposite direction. The second region was the temporoparietal junction, a part of the brain involved in perspective taking, in empathy, in the capacity to understand that other people have inner lives different from our own. The practice of turning attention inward, it seems, also makes us more capable of turning it outward toward others with greater understanding. The third was the posterior cingulate cortex, a region associated with mind wandering and self-referential thinking, the part of the brain that is active when we are lost in our own narratives, rehearsing conversations, replaying memories, worrying about things that have not happened yet. In meditators, this region was altered in ways that suggested a quieter, less agitated relationship to self-referential thought. The fourth was the pons, a structure in the brainstem that serves as a relay station for a remarkable number of regulatory processes, including the production of several important neurotransmitters. The pons is ancient, evolutionarily speaking, far older than the thinking brain above it. That mindfulness reaches this deep into these old and fundamental structures is something that researchers are still working to fully understand. And then there is the amygdala. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons located deep in the brain, and it is the structure most closely associated with fear, anxiety, and the stress response. When you feel threatened, physically, socially, emotionally, the amygdala is one of the first structures to activate. It sends signals that trigger the release of stress hormones, that prepare the body for fight or flight, that narrow attention and amplify vigilance. In people who undergo mindfulness training, the amygdala shrinks. Physically, measurably shrinks. And this reduction in size correlates directly with reductions in reported stress. The more the amygdala shrinks, the calmer people feel. The practice is not just changing the experience of the mind, it is changing the physical organ that generates that experience. There is something deeply reassuring in this, if you sit with it for a moment. The anxiety you feel, the stress that tightens your chest, the worry that keeps you awake. And one of the things that changes it is simply paying attention, gently, without judgment, to what is happening right now. Richard Davidson, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has spent decades exploring the neural basis of emotion and how it can be transformed through practice. His work has taken him into collaboration with some of the most experienced meditators in the world, monks who have practiced for tens of thousands of hours, and who, when placed in brain scanners, show patterns of neural activity that are simply unlike anything seen in ordinary subjects. Unusual coordination between different brain regions, a kind of neural coherence that Davidson describes as reflecting a quality of mind that is simultaneously highly alert and profoundly calm. What Davidson found, and what has been replicated in various forms since, is that this quality of mind is not a fixed gift, it is a skill. And like any skill, it can be developed, practiced, and deepened over time. The brain, it turns out, is listening to what you do with it. We have been talking about structure, about the physical shape of the brain changing over time. But there is another layer to this story, one that moves faster and feels more immediate. The chemistry. Every thought you have, every emotion you feel, every moment of calm or agitation, all of it is mediated by chemistry, by molecules moving across the tiny gaps between neurons, by hormones traveling through the bloodstream, by the electrical charge of ions crossing cell membranes. The experience of being human is, among other things, a vast and intricate chemical event. And mindfulness changes that chemistry. The most well-studied change involves a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol is often described as the stress hormone, though that framing is a little reductive. Cortisol is essential and useful, involved in waking us up in the morning, regulating blood sugar, supporting immune function. The problem is not cortisol itself, but chronic cortisol. the state of sustained low-level stress that keeps cortisol elevated day after day, week after week, year after year. Chronic cortisol has a corrosive effect on the body. It suppresses immune function. It disrupts sleep. It damages the hippocampus. It contributes to inflammation, to cardiovascular disease, to the gradual wearing down of almost every system in the body. And it is extraordinarily common because modern life, its relentlessness, its noise, its endless demands, is very good at producing it. Mindfulness practice reduces cortisol. But the chemistry goes deeper than cortisol. There is an enzyme called telomerase. Its job is to protect and maintain the telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, rather like the plastic tips at the end of shoelaces. Telomeres naturally shorten over time as cells divide, and the shortening of telomeres is associated with aging, with cellular decline, with a reduced capacity for the body to repair and renew itself. Chronic stress accelerates this shortening. Mindfulness practice has been linked to increased telomerase activity. The cells of regular meditators appear to be better at maintaining their own integrity. The practice reaches into the biology of aging itself, into the mechanisms by which cells stay healthy and functional across time. This is not a small thing. It suggests that the effects of mindfulness are not limited to the brain or to the experience of stress, but extend into the deepest levels of biological function. And then there is the immune system. The immune system is exquisitely sensitive to psychological state. Chronic stress suppresses it. This is why people under prolonged stress get more colds, why wounds heal more slowly in times of anxiety, why grief can make a person physically unwell. The immune system and the nervous system are in constant conversation, and when the nervous system is chronically activated, the immune system pays a price. Mindfulness, by calming the nervous system, also tends to support immune function. Studies have found that meditators show stronger immune responses to vaccines, greater activity of natural killer cells, lower levels of inflammatory markers in the blood. The practice of becoming still, it turns out, is one of the most profoundly anti-inflammatory things a person can do. Jon Kabat-Zinn has spoken and written about something he calls selfing, the constant background narrative of I, me, mine that runs through the waking mind. We are almost always, to some degree, telling ourselves a story about ourselves, rehearsing what we said or should have said, worrying about how we are perceived, planning, judging, comparing. This narrative is not wrong or bad. It is part of being a social creature, a being who exists in relationship to others. But when it runs unchecked, when it becomes a loop that plays without pause, it is exhausting. It keeps the stress response gently, chronically activated. It keeps the cortisol slightly elevated. It keeps the body in a state of subtle readiness that never quite resolves into rest. Mindfulness, Kabat-Zinn suggests, does not eliminate this narrative, but it changes our relationship to it. We begin to see it as a narrative, as something the mind is doing, rather than as the simple truth of what is happening. And in that small shift of perspective, there is something he describes as breathing room, a little space between the experience and the reaction, a little room to choose. That breathing room, that soft, small gap, is where much of the chemistry of calm begins. Science is not a destination, it is a direction. And the science of mindfulness is still very much in motion, still discovering, still revising, still reaching toward questions that do not yet have answers. Some of what has been found in recent years is quietly corrective, not that the benefits were not real. Many of them clearly were. but that the quality of the research was uneven, that some studies were small or poorly controlled, and that the enthusiasm for mindfulness had sometimes outpaced the rigor of the science behind it. This is not a reason to dismiss mindfulness. It is a reason to hold it honestly, to appreciate what is genuinely known and to remain curious and open about what is not yet known. And there is much that is not yet known. One of the most fascinating areas of ongoing inquiry involves what researchers are beginning to call advanced meditation. Most of the studies we have discussed so far have looked at relatively modest amounts of practice. 8 weeks of MBSR, 40 minutes a day, the kind of meditation that is accessible to almost anyone. And these studies have found real, meaningful changes. But what happens when a person has been practicing for years, for decades, for tens of thousands of hours? This is the territory that Richard Davidson has been exploring in his collaborations with experienced Tibetan Buddhist monks. These are people who have spent their lives in practice, who have done retreats lasting months or years, who have explored the inner landscape with a depth and consistency that is simply not comparable to anything studied in typical clinical trials. When these practitioners are placed in brain scanners, what emerges is genuinely different from what is seen in novice meditators. The gamma wave activity, high-frequency oscillations associated with heightened awareness and integration, is extraordinary. In some monks, it is the highest ever recorded in a non-pathological context. It persists into ordinary waking life. The practice has, over years and decades, fundamentally altered the baseline state of the brain. What does this feel like from the inside? The accounts from experienced practitioners describe states of consciousness that are difficult to translate into ordinary language. Deep stillness. A quality of awareness that is simultaneously vast and intimate. States that some traditions call bliss, or clarity, or the recognition of the nature of mind. Matthew Sachet, who leads the meditation research program at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, is working to study these advanced states with the same rigor that has been applied to beginner and intermediate practice. It is a nascent field. The questions are large and the answers are still forming. Another active area of research involves the question of who benefits most from mindfulness and under what conditions. Ami Shija, a neuroscientist at the University of Miami, has been exploring this question in some of the most demanding environments imaginable, with military personnel, with medical professionals, with people in high-stress, high-demand roles who are at significant risk for burnout and trauma-related mental illness. Her research has found that even relatively brief mindfulness training, a few weeks of short daily practice, can strengthen what she calls attentional resilience, the capacity to maintain focus under pressure, to recover attention when it has been pulled away by stress or distraction, to remain in some essential sense present even in conditions that are designed to fragment and overwhelm. This finding has implications that extend well beyond the clinical setting. It suggests that mindfulness is not just a tool for managing illness or reducing stress in people who are already struggling. It is a capacity, a trainable human capacity that has value in almost any context where sustained attention and emotional regulation matter, which is to say, almost every context. Richard Davidson has also raised a thought-provoking question about the scope of current mindfulness research. He notes that modern secular mindfulness has tended to focus on a narrow slice of what the broader contemplative traditions actually contain. But the traditional frameworks within which these practices were embedded also included analytic practices, ways of actively investigating the nature of reality, of examining assumptions, of cultivating wisdom. And ethical frameworks, ways of orienting the whole life toward values like compassion, generosity, and non-harm. Davidson wonders whether these other elements, the ethics, the analysis, the broader orientation of a life, might also produce neural changes, and whether the exclusive focus on mindfulness as a stress reduction technique might be missing something important. Not wrong, but incomplete. A portion of something larger. These are the conversations happening at the frontier of the field, and they are, in their own way, as interesting as the findings themselves. There is also something worth sitting with in the fact that this ancient practice, developed by human beings sitting quietly in forests and temples thousands of years ago, has now become the subject of some of the most sophisticated neuroscientific research in history, that the wisdom of those early practitioners is being confirmed, refined, and extended by people in laboratories with instruments those practitioners could never have imagined. There is a kind of continuity in that, a thread that runs from a monk sitting beneath a tree in ancient India to a neuroscientist in Boston staring at a brain scan on a glowing screen, both of them trying, in their different ways, to understand what happens when a human being becomes still. We are moving now into quieter water. The science is settling behind us like a distant shoreline. What remains is something simpler. The brainwaves that carry you towards sleep are already beginning to gather. You may have heard the terms before, alpha, theta, delta, but tonight they are not categories to memorize. They are simply descriptions of something that happens naturally, every night, without effort. The brain, as it moves towards sleep, begins to slow. The fast, effortful waves of waking thought give way to something longer and more spacious. Alpha waves wash in, the brain's quiet, receptive mode, the state of a mind that is resting without quite being asleep. This is the state that mindfulness tends to cultivate, a soft, open awareness, not trying to grasp anything, not trying to push anything away. Then, a little deeper, theta waves begin to appear. Theta is the frequency of the threshold, the gentle borderland between waking and sleeping. It is the state in which images sometimes arise unbidden, where the mind begins to loosen its grip on the ordinary logic of the day. Experienced meditators often show increased theta activity even during waking practice. The boundary between meditation and the early stages of sleep is, in some ways, more porous than we might expect. And then, deeper still, the slow and ancient rhythm of delta. The ways of deep sleep. The frequencies at which the body repairs itself, at which memories are consolidated, at which the brain performs its quiet maintenance. This is where rest truly lives, and a mind that has been trained even gently in the art of stillness finds its way there more easily. The cortisol is lower. The amygdala is quieter. The endless narrative of self has loosened its grip, at least a little. The body can finally, fully let go. There is something worth knowing about the hippocampus tonight as you lie there in the dark. That curved structure deep in the brain, the one involved in memory and learning and emotional regulation. It is also one of the structures most active during sleep. While you rest, the hippocampus is busy. It is taking the experiences of the day and slowly transferring them into long-term storage. It is processing, consolidating, filing. It is doing work that cannot be done while you are awake, and a hippocampus that has been nourished by mindfulness practice, that has been, over time, slightly thickened, slightly more robust. Does this work a little more efficiently? Sleep and mindfulness, it turns out, are not separate projects. They are collaborators. There is also something quietly moving in what Richard Davidson's research found about purpose. His team discovered that a sense of purpose in life, a feeling that what you do matters, that your existence has direction and meaning, is not just psychologically important. It is physically important. People in their 60s who reported a low sense of purpose were more than twice as likely to die within 5 years as those who reported a high sense of purpose. The inner life, it turns out, is not separate from the physical life. It is woven into it at every level. Mindfulness, in this light, is not just a stress reduction technique. It is a practice of orientation, of coming back again and again to what is actually here, to the breath moving in and out, to the weight of the body against the bed, to the simple, irreducible fact of being alive in this moment, in this body, on this quiet night. Jon Kabat-Zinn once described mindfulness as the art of conscious living, not a technique to be applied at certain times and then put away, but a way of moving through the world, a way of meeting each moment, including the difficult ones, the painful ones, the ones that feel like too much, with a quality of open, gentle attention. That quality of attention is available to you right now, not as something you need to achieve or work toward, simply as a choice, available in any moment to notice what is here. The weight of the blanket, the temperature of the air, the faint sound of the world outside, the slow, patient rhythm of your own breathing. You do not need to do anything with any of it. Just notice, just be here. The researchers in their laboratories, Sarah Lazar with her brain scans, Richard Davidson with his monks, Amishi Jha with her soldiers and doctors, Jon Kabat-Zinn with his patients in chronic pain, all of them, in their different ways, have been trying to measure and describe something that the body already knows how to do, something you are already doing right now, simply by being alive and present in this moment. The brain is listening to what you do with it, and what you are doing right now. Resting, softening, allowing the day to become distant is not nothing. It is something that reaches all the way down into the chemistry of your cells, into the electrical rhythms of your neurons, into the ancient structures of a brain that has been shaped by millions of years of evolution and 2,500 years of human wisdom. You are, right now, in the act of becoming a little more still. And that stillness is not empty. It is full of everything the body needs. The hippocampus is beginning its quiet work. The cortisol is dropping. The amygdala, that small and watchful guardian, is softening its vigilance. The brainwaves are slowing, lengthening, becoming more spacious. The ancient rhythm of deep rest is moving closer. The way a tide moves in, unhurried, patient, vast. Somewhere in the brainstem, in the old and fundamental structures that have been regulating human sleep since long before there were words for any of this, the signals are shifting. The neurotransmitters that promote wakefulness are quieting. The ones that carry you towards sleep are rising. The body knows what to do. It has always known. All that is asked of you is this, nothing more than this. To lie here. To let the breath move at its own pace. To allow the thoughts, when they come, to come and go like weather. Noticed, but not followed. To feel the weight of the body growing heavier, more settled, more at home in the simple fact of rest. The science will still be there tomorrow. The researchers will still be in their laboratories, still scanning, still measuring, still slowly mapping the territory of the quiet mind. There will be more discoveries, more understanding, more of the ancient wisdom confirmed and extended and made legible in the language of neurons and molecules and brainwave frequencies. But tonight, that is not your concern. Tonight, your only task if it can even be called a task, is to let the stillness come. It is already coming. You can feel it in the edges of things, in the way the room has grown softer, in the way the day is becoming something that happened a long time ago to someone who was very busy in a place that is now very far away. Let it go there. Let it stay there. The ancient practitioners who sat beneath trees and by slow rivers, they were not doing something exotic or esoteric. They were doing something deeply human, something the body has always wanted, something that every cell in you recognizes, even if the thinking mind sometimes forgets. They were learning to be here, just now. And you are doing the same thing right now, in this quiet, in this dark, in this slow and patient breathing. And so we leave it here. Somewhere behind you, the day has already grown distant. The science, the history, the beautiful complexity of the brain, all of it can rest now, the way everything rests in the dark. You have done enough today. You have carried enough. The stillness is here. It has always been here, waiting beneath the noise, patient as an old river. Drift now, if you're ready. Sleep well. There is a man named Mathieu Ricard who is sometimes described, a little reductively, as the world's happiest person. He is a French molecular biologist who left a promising scientific career in the 1970s to become a Tibetan Buddhist monk. He has been practicing meditation for more than 50 years, and when Richard Davidson's team placed him in a brain scanner and asked him to generate a state of compassion, what they recorded was so far outside the normal range of human neural activity that the researchers initially wondered if their equipment was malfunctioning. Ricard's brain, during that compassion meditation, showed gamma wave synchrony of a kind and intensity that the laboratory had simply never encountered before. What is quietly striking about Ricard is not the extraordinary data his brain produces in a scanner. It is what he says about the experience of a life shaped by practice. He does not describe it in terms of achievement or attainment. He describes it in terms of familiarity, of having spent so much time in the company of his own mind that the mind has become, in some essential sense, a more hospitable place to live. Less turbulent. Less prone to the sudden storms of reactivity that most of us know well. Not because the storms no longer come, but because the sky in which they move has grown, through practice, somehow larger. That image, the sky growing larger, comes up again and again in contemplative literature across traditions. The Tibetan teachers speak of Ritpa, the recognition of the nature of mind as vast and open, like a clear sky that contains all weather without being diminished by any of it. The Zen tradition speaks of the original face, the quality of awareness that was present before thought, before self-concept, before the accumulated weight of experience began to shape how we see ourselves and the world. The Sufi poets wrote about the heart as a mirror, capable of reflecting the whole of reality when it was polished by practice and by love. Different languages, different metaphors. The same quiet pointing towards something that is apparently real. Something that the brain scans are beginning, in their slow and careful way, to confirm. There is a researcher at Oxford University named Willem Kuyken who has spent years studying a particular application of mindfulness that is worth knowing about tonight, especially if you are someone who has struggled with low mood or with the returning heaviness that depression can bring. Kuyken and his colleagues developed, together with Zindel Segal and Mark Williams, a program called Mindfulness. Based cognitive therapy. MBCT. It was built on the foundation of MBSR but combined it with elements from cognitive therapy, specifically designed for people who had experienced repeated episodes of depression and were at risk of experiencing more. The goal was not to treat active depression but to prevent relapse, to give people a set of skills that would allow them to recognize the early warning signs of a depressive episode and respond to them differently. The results were significant enough that the British National Health Service eventually incorporated MBCT into its clinical guidelines as a recommended treatment for recurrent depression. In trials, the program reduced the risk of relapse by roughly 40% in people who had experienced 3 or more previous episodes. For the most vulnerable patients, those with a history of childhood trauma or the most frequent episodes, the benefit was even more pronounced. What MBCT does, at its core, is teach people to notice the difference between being in a thought and observing a thought. When depression begins to return, certain patterns of thinking tend to arise. Self-critical thoughts, hopeless thoughts, the familiar gravitational pull of a mind beginning to collapse inward on itself. For most people, the response to these thoughts is to engage with them, to argue with them or be swept along by them, which tends to amplify and deepen them. MBCT teaches a different response. To notice the thought as a thought, to see it as an event in the mind rather than a statement of fact, to let it be there without necessarily following it. This is not a technique for suppressing difficult feelings. It is almost the opposite. It is a practice of allowing feelings to be present, held in a wider awareness, without letting them become the whole of the experience. The meditators in the ancient traditions would have recognized this immediately. It is what they were practicing in different words all along. There is a quality that researchers have begun to describe as decentering, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it may be one of the most practically useful things that mindfulness practice offers. Decentering is the capacity to observe your own thoughts and feelings as temporary, passing events rather than as direct reflections of reality. It is the difference between thinking I am worthless and noticing I am having the thought that I am worthless. The content of the thought is the same, but the relationship to it has shifted almost infinitely. This shift sounds simple. It is not. Mindfulness practice provides something like a mirror, not a perfect one, not a mirror that shows you everything, but a surface in which the mind can, for a moment, catch a glimpse of itself. See that the thought is a thought. See that the feeling is a feeling. See that the self who is observing all of this is not identical to the thoughts and feelings being observed. Judson Brewer, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Brown University, has been studying the neural basis of this decentering capacity and its applications in treating addiction. His research has found that craving, the urgent, consuming pull toward a substance or a behavior, follows a predictable neural pattern, and that mindfulness training, specifically the practice of turning curious, non-judgmental attention toward the experience of craving itself, can disrupt that pattern in ways that conventional willpower-based approaches cannot. His work with smokers found that mindfulness training was more than twice as effective as the American Lung Association's best existing program for smoking cessation, not because it suppressed the desire to smoke, but because it changed the relationship to that desire. People learned to be curious about the craving rather than overwhelmed by it, to notice how it felt in the body, the tension, the restlessness, the particular quality of the wanting, and to observe it rising and, in time, passing. The wave came, and then the wave went, and they were still there, still intact, on the other side of it. That same principle applies to many of the difficult experiences that keep people awake at night. The anxiety that tightens in the chest, the loop of worry that the mind returns to, again and again. The grief that sits heavy and close. These are not problems to be solved by thinking harder about them. They are experiences to be held gently in a wider awareness, noticed, allowed, and, in time, allowed to pass. There is something that happens in the body during long exhalations that is worth knowing about, particularly in those moments when sleep feels far away and the mind is restless and busy. The breath is one of the only autonomic functions, one of the processes that the body regulates automatically without conscious direction. That can also be consciously controlled. You do not have to think about your heartbeat. You do not have to direct your digestion. But you can choose at any moment to breathe differently, and that choice has direct, immediate effects on the nervous system. When you exhale for longer than you inhale, you activate the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the branch associated with rest, digestion, and recovery. The vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem all the way down through the chest and abdomen, carries signals in both directions, and a long, slow exhale sends a signal downward through that nerve that is essentially a message to the whole body. It is safe to relax. The heart rate slows slightly with each long exhale. The muscles soften. The state of gentle vigilance that the body maintains during ordinary waking life begins to ease. This is not a technique that requires training or practice to produce an effect. It works the first time you try it. Right now, if you like, without any effort at all, just allowing the next exhale to be a little longer than it needs to be, a little slower, a little more complete, and then the one after that. The ancient meditators knew this. Many traditions of breath practice involve extended exhalations as a foundation. The yogic tradition of pranayama has hundreds of breath practices, many of them centering on the ratio of inhalation to exhalation. The Sufi practice of daika involves rhythmic breathing coordinated with repeated phrases. Christian contemplative traditions developed the hesychast practice of prayer coordinated with the breath. Across the world, across millennia, human beings discovered independently that the breath was a door that opened when approached in a certain way into stillness. The neuroscience has now traced the mechanism, the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic nervous system, the heart rate variability that increases with slow rhythmic breathing and that correlates directly with emotional resilience and well-being. The ancient door has been mapped. The mechanism has been found. There is one more thread worth following tonight before the words begin to thin and the quiet takes over. It involves what happens not during meditation, but in the moments between, in the texture of an ordinary day lived by someone who has been practicing even a little for some time. Researchers studying long-term meditators have found that the changes produced by practice do not stay neatly inside the meditation session. They begin to seep outward, to color the rest of life. People report noticing more small details of the world that they previously walked past without seeing. The quality of light through a window, the sound of rain before they were fully awake. The face of someone they love, encountered with a freshness that daily familiarity had previously dimmed. This heightened noticing is not the effortful hypervigilance of anxiety. It is something softer and more spacious, a kind of permeability to experience. The world has not changed, but the filter through which it is perceived has become, very slightly, more transparent. Ellen Langer, a social psychologist at Harvard who has spent decades studying what she calls mindlessness and mindfulness in ordinary life, describes a related phenomenon in her research. She found that people who were encouraged to notice new things about their environments, not to meditate, simply to pay attention with fresh eyes, showed measurable improvements in health, in mood, in cognitive flexibility. The act of noticing, it seems, is inherently vitalizing. It is the opposite of the automatic, habitual, half-asleep way that most of us move through most of our days. Langer's work is a reminder that mindfulness does not require a cushion or a timer or a dedicated practice period. It is available in any moment when you choose to look at something, anything, as if for the first time. The ceiling above you right now, the particular quality of darkness in the room, the sound of your own breathing, which has been happening all day without your noticing, patient and steady and utterly faithful. That faithfulness of the breath is one of the things that contemplative practitioners across traditions have found most anchoring. Whatever else is happening, whatever storm is moving through the mind, whatever difficulty is pressing in from the world outside, the breath is here. It has been here all day. It will be here through the night. It does not require anything of you. It simply continues, steady and unhurried, the most constant companion you have ever had.